Good afternoon. Welcome back to all of our attendees. We're excited to have our next presentation on climate smart strategies for the wine industry with Dr. Roger Boulton from UC Davis. I've had the privilege of listening to Roger speak on climate strategies for the wine industry at a few different presentations, including at the Porto Climate Change Conference. And it provides great foundational information on sort of the problem and the ways in which our industry can be part of the solution. So without further ado, I will allow Roger to begin, and we will also have time for Q&A. And don't forget, if you have a question, please feel free to provide the question in the Q&A box that shows up on the bottom of your screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. So the task this afternoon is to try to change perspective a little bit, but try to relate long-term patterns in climate conditions, to relate them back to short-term flares or mega fires being particularly prominent right now. So what I want to do is try and cover some aspects of climate that we don't see. I want to talk about some things we can do immediately and some things we can do long-term, and how we would actually build wineries to actually operate in a more climate smart environment. So the first is that the problem we're dealing with is an invisible one, and that's challenging to many people. But so I'll just go straight to the point. The metrics we should be talking about are atmospheric CO2 content, carbon dioxide, and the metrics of the ice cap, particularly in September when they go to a minimum. We can talk about cyclones, and we can talk about lightning strikes, and we can talk about droughts and floods and maybe temperature rise. But these things are vibrational echoes and often long delayed after when the initial thump started. And some of these things are accumulating over long periods of time, and we're just beginning to see some of the vibrations reach a point where we say there's something happened. So the first one is the time scale of the ice cap. We think of the ice caps as going to be melting most severely in the middle of summer. Well, it doesn't. Their minimum is typically September, 3 months after peak summer. And that's because of just the delay in thermal heat transfer and accumulation and melting is what leads to that, is a 3-month gap. So if I said to you the wind yesterday had something to do with some environmental piece in the Northern Hemisphere 3 months ago, most people would say no, that there's no connection. And the answer, what don't you understand is many of these things are on that kind of time scale. The second is over the last 5 years, we've increased the atmosphere by 15 parts per million. And we're currently doing it at that kind of rate. But it's taken us 150 years to get to the point which we currently are at. So we can talk about trying to do things to change it, but we've got to recognize if it took 150 years to get there, how long are we prepared to actually take actions to try to reverse it? And the last point is that even if we were carbon neutral, if we stop using fossil fuels tomorrow, we still will sit in 414 parts per million, and the ice caps will keep on melting. So it's not good enough, and it never has been good enough, to simply talk about arresting the fossil fuel emission. That's the kindergarten. We need to get onto elementary and high school and onto college, because we're past the kindergarten point. Now the question is, how do we decarbonize the atmosphere that us and our grandparents and others before us continue to put into the atmosphere, this CO2 content? So it's the decarbonizing of the atmosphere, which is what I believe the wine industry ought to be leading. And the principal example of that will be the fermentation emissions. We'll come to that in a minute. So 2 examples. One would be to phase out fossil fuels. That's an obvious one, makes to most of us, but it's still something we have to do as an industry or as a business or as a community. And that'll slow down the rate of accumulation, but it won't make it go backwards. And what you've got to realize is when we've eliminated that, we're still going to be sitting in an unsatisfactory situation. Most of you have been involved in solar electricity adoption, The question now is, where's the batteries? Where's the electric cars and vehicles? Where's the hydrogen? Where's the storage systems? These are the next step in being completely independent of fossil fuel energy, electricity in particular. The other is something that can be done immediately, and depending on your definitions and whether you think it's your problem or not, is to start a bottle return and reuse program. We'll come back to that later, but that's something you could do immediately. It's something that you could have a conversation with, and you could lead by example that would have an immediate impact on this industry's footprint in the world of commercial trade. And that's the synthesis and production and repeated breaking and melting of bottles. The second one is the getting out of the fossil fuel world and getting back into the biogenic cycle. And the question now comes is, we actually want to increase the capture of carbon into plants and soil and the capture term. And we want to actually start to prevent the release and return point if we're going to change this balance of atmospheric carbon dioxide. And so instead of letting fermentation emissions go straight into the air, we have the opportunity to capture them. And if we were to capture them and sequester them, we could greatly influence the biogenic cycle to our advantage. And the way to do that is to begin to capture wine fermentations, any ethanol fermentation condition at the point of release, would-be release, and convert it into a form which is stable and can be used for other things. So I'll give you those examples later, but that's the carbon capture and sequestration and that business. So the ice caps and the carbon dioxide content, again, it's a simple relationship and most people can't see it. We can't see it because it's invisible, and we can't see it because the consequences are 1,000 miles away. This is the atmospheric carbon dioxide from 1870, where it's just below 280 parts per million, up until this September, where it's now 414 parts per million. You can see the spiral. And if you were talking about a stable cycling system, this would be a circle. It's clearly not a circle. And it hasn't been a circle almost since the beginning of the century. This is the September Arctic ice cap, which is the extent in millions of kilometers of ice measured in September, because that's the minimum. Notice that this was 11 million back in 1870. And now understand the inner spiral is we're down to 3.7 in September of this year, the second lowest on record. And clearly the question is, when we get to the center of this diagram, there is no ice cap. There are no polar bears. That is not a good thing from a commercial shipping trade point of view. That's a disaster from the world's climate and ecology and weather conditions. So the ice caps are actually melting and consuming a lot of energy to do that, which is hidden from the global warming picture. And when we run out of ice caps, we run out of that melting heat capturing system. And now air temperature and ocean temperatures will change dramatically because we no longer have this absorption that's occurring by ice cap melting. Here's the relationship if you plotted one against the other. Left-hand side is square kilometers, millions. The bottom is parts per million of carbon dioxide. You'll notice that relationship is 0.949. In the world of science, that's a pretty good indication that those things are directly related to each other. And every 15 parts per million increase, which is typically about 5 years on current pace, causes another million. Remember, we're at 3.7. We're about 4 million currently. If we're going to lose another 1 million every 5 years, we've got about 20 years before we've melted the ice cap. This is a diagram from a paper back in 2007. It's talking about the, on the left-hand side here, the extent, the ice cap extent in September. The black line and the gray around it is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change model. And the gray curve is the standard deviations around that. So notice that the IPCC model said that by 2021, we were going to have 3 million square kilometers. We're actually going to melt the ice caps. No one back in 2007 or 2001, when this was released, seemed to care about that. More important is this particular paper showed in red were the observations. And by 2007, they had shown that it's actually a lot worse than the models indicate. There is a lot less ice cap than the model would predict. I've gone down from since then, from 2007 to currently, and you'll see what the pattern is. It's dramatically different from what the model is. We're at a point that we shouldn't be at for 60 more years, even with the model, even with the ice caps melting. And the irony of all of this is the year in which this organization receives the Nobel Prize is the very same year this paper is published. So this is serious stuff. I mean, I can't emphasize that enough, but I want you to see the trend, and I want you to see the significance of it as we talk about climate change when the ice caps have gone. The other feature we see or might see, but again, most of us don't see it, is because we're not on the ocean and we're not on an inland water stretch, which is almost going to be flooded. Sorry. So here's the melting of the Antarctic, and here's the Greenland, and they're both on that trend over the last 20 years. But the sea level is the bottom curves here. So this is the rise in sea level in millimeters from 1990s onwards. It's going up at about 3 millimeters per year. We would recognize that. It's a small number. But if you go back and look at it from 1880 to current day, we've actually increased 250 millimeters. That's about 10 inches. Try to understand where the water level is, the Pacific Ocean, and imagine what it was back then, 10 inches less. These are from NASA's climate site. If you're in doubt of any kind of information of that kind, you could go there and you could see this. The last one I want to draw to is given the fires and given the climate change, the environment that caused this in this recent events were a series of droughts, climate change, and a set of frequent firestorms or lightning strikes in a particular area. The coincidence of those two things at a given point in time. And so I'll give you the example in Australia, which is where now the discussion is about what's the dry fuel status of your community. And this is published in Nature Climate, interesting journal. You might want to look at it periodically. But so this is from September 2019, almost this time last year in Australia, up until January. Okay, 5.8 million hectares were burnt in these fires. The Gosper fire in particular near Sydney, 500,000 hectares, okay, roughly over 1.2 million acres. Does that sound familiar? It was caused by lightning strikes. Does that sound familiar? Today is what, 28th of October. Those fires started a year ago. A year ago in the Southern Hemisphere is the beginning of spring. So these fires continued to burn almost for 3 months until late in January. Does that sound familiar? I think it does. The point is that the metric there now is what is the area that's under what's referred to as dry fuel state. And I think Scott will probably talk more about this in the following presentation. But it's really about trying to map how much dry material there is, because that's the initial condition that would then superimpose with a drought period. And now the risk of lightning strikes or other events is what leads to these megafires. And I think there's very good precedent that this is not just a once-off example in California or a once-off example in Australia. I think we'll be seeing much more of this. Now we need to understand the circumstances that led to them. Quick summary of carbon, grapes and wine. Vines take up about 1,250 pounds in a ton of grapes. If we translate that to bottles, it's about 670 grams of carbon in a bottle of wine that were taken up by the plant as it's growing. The grapes themselves contain about 264 pounds per ton, about 160 grams are actually the sugar carbon equivalent that's in a bottle of wine. Now, half of that in fermentation will be released. So it's the 80 grams of that being released into the atmosphere that leaves the other 80 grams in the ethanol content of the bottle of wine. It's this release of carbon that I'll be talking about capturing and trying to intervene in this 80 going straight back into the air. The electricity use when we're making wine would be of the order of 60 grams to make a 750 ml bottle. And a new bottle is actually 450 grams to make a new bottle. So look at what a vineyard cluster takes up. Look at what a fermentation releases. Look at what is the electricity, and look at what is the new bottle. And I don't have to point out to you why we need to change our bottle practices. And I think I've already emphasized why you need to move away from fossil fuel electricity. And now the question is, what can we do about the fermentation emission? Those are the points I want to leave you with today. So short term is to avoid smashing up glass bottles and remelting them, because it's the latent heat and the melting which is causing the fuel, which is causing the carbon dioxide to be released. So having made a bottle, the question is, why don't you use it many times, not once? And that's not recycling, that's reuse. So that the bottle falls under scope 3 of most carbon calculators. It's been set up that way, and that's the definitions. So a lot of people say, well, we don't have to worry about reducing our scope 3. I'll suggest to you as a citizen of the planet, you probably do. The other point is that most sustainability programs won't address that very well. And so we're faced with, what do? We could be very sustainable and have a lot of certificates, but we still continue to have this problem. The Strauss milk bottle is the example I'll give you in just a minute. There's currently no redemption value on wine bottles in California. You might want to think about that. And the other is that in many of the practices and reuse and examples of other people, to consider joining a group like the Porto Protocol, which is an international community of people who are interested in this problem and trying to share solutions with each other, irrespective of nationality or organization or of any kind. It's actually relatively free of the normal industry perspectives. The other is we've got to get long-term carbon capture and sequestration. To do that, we need to build wineries which are going to do that and have zero emission. We actually have to encourage and talk about people getting into trading markets for carbon, because we want to trade the value of the captured carbon, and we want to actually get the credits for having sequestered it. So that's the future business. And that's not about scope 3 and bottles or fossil fuel. That's about farming, and that's about an industry that could capture that. Talk about the carbonate example, which is how we would capture it, and why you'd want to have a winery which is in conjunction with a vineyard, a negative carbon footprint. I think you would agree the world needs negative carbon businesses if we're going to eliminate the, get back to where we were. So here's the Strauss example. They charge $2 a bottle on a bottle of milk. Imagine if we had $2 on a bottle of wine. It's washed and sanitized. It's used an average of 5 times. And they claim that 80% of their bottles are recycled, and not recycled, reused. They're going to use them 5 times. And if they use them 5 times, it means that there's 4 sets of melting of future bottles that didn't go into carbon release. That makes the carbon footprint dramatically smaller in the use of bottles. You could do that tomorrow. We could talk about that in question time. The other is, here's the link for the Porto Protocol. You might notice actually this morning there was one on biodiversity and vines and climate, and one of your members was actually featured on that at 9 o'clock this morning. So go to Porto Protocol and see if it fits for you, but it's a complementary group to the kind of things you're doing as Napa Valley growers. I want to turn quickly now to the issue of climate smart wineries. And they'll have to be self-sustainable in energy, so they're not using fossil fuel. They'll actually be a bit more independent in water sources, so they can ride out droughts. And the question now comes is, what's the engineering of the capture and the storage that you could do that? We want to capture CO2, and we want to, in the future, sequester it on site. And we want to deliver that on-site product to somebody else who has a business who will make use of it. But we want to capture it and begin to work out those logistics. And we want to get to the carbon negative winery vineyard combination. So the elimination of the fossil fuel is obvious. I think we just touched on that. Now we're talking about the biocycle part. There's an example in Canada of a facility which is called carbon engineering. This group is actually taking carbon dioxide out of the air at 400 parts. I'm talking about capturing CO2 at almost 1 million parts per million at the top of a fermenter. The quantity we would have to treat to get a ton of carbon captured is incredibly small compared to the carbon engineering challenge, which is being pursued. This is a shot of the winery at UC Davis. Some of you are probably aware of the background of that building. This was completed in 2010. You'll notice that it's independent now of the grid and solar. We actually have both solar and batteries for battery storage. It's also independent of the water grid in terms of rainwater capture. And we have practices which would allow that to actually be off the water grid. So we have lots of fermenters, we have small ones, we have lots of surface area per volume. We would have a very large water footprint if we followed traditional practices. The purpose of this facility was to reuse water, filter, sterilize it, go back and use it again. And that's a capture, recovery, storage, reuse program for water, which is not too different from what we just talked about in bottles. All of these tanks are designed for direct carbon capture. This winery has been operating for 10 years. And so there's a decade of carbon captured example. The winery itself runs off the photovoltaics, but we also run a battery pack, which is the container full of used car batteries from Nissan Leaf cars. And so we charge that daily, and we can operate off that at nighttime, and we can operate in daytime, completely independent of the grid. And we're producing more than we use, so we're net positive all of the time. This is back in 2012. This is just a snapshot of 2 days. Notice this is in February, so not quite midwinter, but certainly not midsummer. The winery overnight, before we had the batteries, was using about 80 kW in the nighttime period. Each 24 hours. This is a 24-hour cycle. But the solar panels from that winery were generating over 400 kilowatt hours on a daily basis. So we were generating 400 kW, kWh. We were at that time attached to the grid using 160 at night. We've now replaced that nighttime usage with battery backup, and you can see that this place has been energy positive for a very long time. This is inside the container that holds the batteries. These are 120 battery packs out of Nissan Leaf cars, ones that have been swapped out because they've already been used for 3 years. So they're not perfect. They don't charge to 100%, but they still give us the capability to operate in this mode. The winery's design was to capture all of that CO2, and we've been doing that. And we also proposed, well, long before that, but even before 2010, we'd proposed capturing carbon dioxide into lime water solutions of calcium carbonate. And the feature of calcium carbonate is it would allow us to filter and collect the particles in captured carbonate form using calcium oxide as the trapping agent. This is chalk. And so if we could recover the chalk, we've actually sequestered the carbon. We didn't have to compress the gas. We didn't have to do a phase change. We don't have lots of high pressure safety conditions. A lot of simplicity if you could just make chalk and store it. This is carbon engineering. You could go to their website and take a look at what they do. Again, they're taking it from air, but they're actually making calcium carbonate, the very same technology we proposed almost 20 years ago. And so this is a good validation that this is the way to go. And hopefully we can begin to do that in more wineries in California. This is our rainwater storage that we could operate at Davis. These tanks are now being full. We filter this to high sterility and high organic carbon content. So in the world of pharmaceutical quality water, we filter the water to be about 10 times cleaner than is what is called pharma grade water. The building is highly thermally insulated, so it doesn't need air conditioning. These are the daily temperature peaks in a period in August. This internal wave is the temperature patterns. And you can see that without air conditioning, the temperature swings that are normally seen attenuated almost 20-fold to a building which doesn't need external energy for cooling. So it is about the atmospheric CO2 and it is about climate change. And we'll see them as droughts and rainfall changes, and we'll perhaps see them in storm. What we see now is storm intensity. Other people in the world of climatology would tell you more about that. I just want you to understand the global scale of the physics that are occurring and whether we can play a role in that. These things are changing on decades. So I saw a correlation recently where people were correlating rain and drought patterns in the Western United States with the surface temperatures of the Pacific Ocean 2 years earlier. And you'd say, well, that has nothing to do with what we saw last week. And remember the concept of vibration. Imagine if the vibration 2 years ago had to go around the world many times, 700 and whatever, 20 times, before it got to the point of causing an impact. That's the kind of behavior that we see in climate. And that's why it's not easy to talk about yesterday and today. We need to decarbonize the atmosphere and return to conditional. And we won't be seeing these things. So we've got to understand them. We've got to provide advocacy and education, and we've actually got to do it, but be very patient. As we go into question time, I hope we can maybe answer some questions related to carbon footprints and the difference between what might be a corporate carbon footprint and what might be a farm carbon footprint, and then the real calculations, and discuss this sense of reusing bottles, not recycling them, the concept of fermentation capturing and how we might do it, and why we want to be capturing and playing a role in the farming and the commercial trading of the carbon credits into a carbon market. So we have the global responsibility to stop releasing the most concentrated emission of carbon dioxide as part of our activities. And we have an opportunity to be part of the decarbonising of the atmosphere. That's a wonderful place to be in, and that's where we are. The second part is the part of patience and doing something without the expectation to see the outcome. And for that, you actually have to go into perhaps the mind of somebody like Gandhi. And his quote essentially says, whatever you do will be insignificant, but it's very important that you do it. And this is a challenge of our time where we'll have to do things which are insignificant, but we'll have to do them because it's important. So let me stop there. I'll be happy to answer questions. I've got a number of other slides I could show if it comes up in question time, but let's turn back and have as much conversation as we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger. And, I think when we were planning this fire recovery seminar, some obvious topics came to mind, which we talked about earlier today, crop insurance and contracting related to smoke exposure. And tomorrow we have some speakers coming to speak with us on things like technical assistance for cleanup, rebuild, all these kind of immediate things that growers need to be thinking about and doing and responsive to. But, as an organization that wants to take a leadership role in recovery, I think we feel like we wanted to vision a little bit further ahead and think not only about the immediate response that's needed, but long-term, what are we going to do to prevent, future fires like this, or to position our community in a better way to respond to fire pressures. And I think it's become clear to us through our experience with wildfire that, our agricultural permanence, which Napa Valley is very much concerned with preservation of agriculture. It really depends on our ability to be climate resilient. And so I think it's empowering to hear that, not only do we depend on climate resilience, but actually we can support climate resilience through our practices. And complementing what you're talking about in the winery, which I was excited to bring to everyone today. Grape Growers is going to be working. We've started a vineyard trial in partnership with Oakville Station and UC Davis and Cal Poly San Luis Obispo to look into how healthy soils can sequester more carbon and what specific practices we could be advocating for from best practices standpoint in the field. And so I think we're going to probably talk about that when the trial is a little bit farther along in a future event. But I think what you're bringing up is so important that, it's not just what can we do in the vineyard, but it's also what can we be doing in the winery side of our operations that complements the sort of climate benefits of agricultural land. And so I think, I would be interested to hear more about how our, before we dive into the Q&A, because I see there's a few questions there, I would love for you to kind of talk a little bit about how maybe members could get involved in some of the research and the work that you're doing.
Well, I'm not doing it anymore because I'm retired now, but others will. So the point is, yes, of course, others can. But these are typically topics that would not be funded by industry organizations. That's part of the challenge. So how do we change that? And we've got to change that. But the contributions typically are, where's the resources to do these experiments better? So if people are going to do a project, my only comment was, could you pull in 2 other people who could analyze 2 other things, because they could never set up that experiment. So how do you get the most out of having done an experiment of some kind? And that's the question is, you don't want more of that necessarily done. What you want is a deeper version of that done with the same intensity and activity. And as an industry, I'll be honest, having watched my career go by, we're not very good at that. And we've got to get better at doing that, because that's the way to be more effective. The other point is, I think I might have said it to different people in conversations, is this is like breaking ground on a well, draw the analogy. This would be like breaking ground on a new university campus that your grandchildren might go to, but you're probably not going to see it even being built. And then people say, well, what are you doing that for? And the answer is, well, I've got to do it for 50 years from now. And I think it challenges our character as individuals and as groups, is whether we do something which is going to be showing up in 50 years and we won't see it. If we're so self-absorbed and we're so concerned about short-term gain, we never will do the thing that's 50 years. And I would suggest that's part of what's led to where we are. How do we change that culture as well as the actions related to it? And that's got to be start with yourself and start with more people and grow it. And I think that's where these organizations, interested people, not everybody, interested people, and people who can engage 1 or 2 other people to be growing geometrically. But it's got to come from a good scientific background. It's got to be done with trust and openness. And that's the kind of thing that these projects lead to. So, and the replication of that in different sites and different places. So typically, as I said, funding projects related to climate change would not be an objective of any organization in the industry that I'm aware of. And the question is, how do you encourage that? Well, we'll have to change that. And we'll have to say our charter is a little different. We have to begin to do something. So those are all, there's a mix of philosophy there. I wasn't trying to sound like a philosopher, but the point is, doing what we're doing is not good enough. It's stopping what we're doing is actually going to leave us sitting in a mess. We actually have to clean up the mess for the last 100 years. Now, people before us didn't see it. They didn't recognize it was a mess. It doesn't matter. This is where we are today. this is where we're going. We need to not go there, and we need to start to go backwards. And how do we get the collective organizations and the collective will to want to do that? And that's what you and others are doing right now. So for the same reason I talked about the carbon capturing, we've operated the winery at school for 10 years. We have no grants to support any of that work from the industry. That's sad, but we could change that. We could change that quickly. We could change it tomorrow if there was a will to do so. And I'm glad the work is going on at Oakville. That's why I've been perhaps advocating the Porter Protocol, because there are people in other countries who have the very same problems. And sometimes they've had them earlier and more extreme. And so how do we learn from others? And that requires a little bit of modesty to say that you need to learn. And again, how do we develop that thinking as a group that we could learn from international examples and communicate? If I was a grower, I would like to know what's happening in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Argentina, and Chile this year. Not just one report. I would like to know, because many of these things seem to be on oscillatory cycle patterns, and some of them, like the El Nino effects, take 3 or 5 years to accumulate and then happen. So the more we can understand global conditions, the more we'll understand the basis of things like the fires. And again, people will say, well, this was a random catastrophic disaster caused by lightning strikes. And the answer is, if the lightning strikes that hit green grass or green foliage, it would have been a fire. How did you not have green foliage and dry conditions? That's a drought. How did you have multiple years of droughts? And now, how do you have the randomness of this location, this storm, both in the same place, that results in a catastrophic condition like we just saw? And that's chaotic kind of events, none of which in themselves are causing anything, but they're riding along with different oscillations and periodically are going to be occurring at a certain point in time. That's the nature of climate change, where people, I think it's just slowly changing and it's going to cause something. Well, global warming wasn't the cause of the fires. It was the drought and the storms and the history and the accumulation of dry matter. These are the events. We've got to think in this kind of way as we go forward on projects and strategies and so forth.
Yeah, and I think your point of sort of speaking with other regions around the world is so important. There's a parallel with that, with the ways in which we had to reach out to Australia for information on smoke taint. I think there's a lot of information to be shared from a lot of different lenses. And so we have more questions coming in. So let me kind of get a few of those to you. The first one is earthlylabs.com is working with breweries to capture CO2 and reuse or resell. Maybe wineries should start partnering. And I'll add to that question, this idea of reusing and resell, the captured carbon. Do you have any kind of insight into or ideas about that from both a winery and vineyard perspective?
Sure. So if you look at the CO2 content released in a brewing fermentation, if they do a high gravity condition, which in brewing terms is what we would call normal low sugar bricks. So you're going to get perhaps 40, sometimes 30 liters of CO2 per liter of beer. We're at 60, but let's say 30. The CO2 carbonation is maybe 2 atmospheres worth. So 2 liters, 2 will go into the carbon dioxide in your beer. What happened to the other 28? So it's true, it's real, but that's not the solution. It's not the solution at all. You would need to produce a lot more carbonated beverages with that if you were going to get rid of it. So it can be done. We could do that, except we don't make a lot of sparkling wine with CO2 injection. If we did, that would have been the answer. So it's small, it's real. They can do it, but that's not the answer, and they're not the outlet. The outlet ought to be, how do you partner with a group like Carbon Engineering, who would take the calcium carbonate we make because they want to release it and make algae grow or make hydrocarbons or make other cellular protein for food. So all of the industries which want to grow into carbon sources will want a reliable carbon source, and that's captured calcium carbonate. How do we get onto the train which delivers it to them so that exists? Our businesses will better capture it and get it ready. And so compressing it and making it liquid are very energy intensive, and they require lots of safety requirements and lots of transport and shipping laws. If we made it as a dry powder, it's not toxic, and it's in fact much easier to transport. More important, it's more dense in its carbon capture than either liquid or compressed gas. So it's the densest way to take the carbon somewhere. And when they're finished, they would give us back the calcium oxide for next year to make more calcium carbonate. So long answer, but essentially you can do that, but it's small. And we have to begin to do that. The question is, where's the truckloads of calcium carbonate and where are they going to go? That industry has now grown up. That'll be growing further. We need to go back and start to work out how to get into that game. Jay's question was, are you aware of any wineries already reusing wine bottles that are shipped and returned nationally? And the answer is I'm not. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm not. Whether you do it nationally, the question really would be, can you do it locally? So in Napa Valley, in the North Coast, Strauss doesn't export, okay, but their business is probably mostly in Northern California. Could a winery develop a bottle for a brand and just do one and test market it where it would be returned and picked up within Northern California or the Bay Area, whatever what? How would you do that? And I think Strauss is a very good example, and would be interesting to have somebody from the Strauss family talking about their approach to that and how they do it. Because if people are prepared to pay $2 once when they buy the bottle, when they take the bottle back next time, they don't pay the $2, they've got the bottle. So every time they take the bottle back, they're just recycling their $2. They're not paying $2 more. How do we get that on a $20 or $25 or other bottle of wine? So that's a good example. It's local. We could start locally, and you could then maybe go nationally. But could we just do something? And could we get one example in the wine industry? That'd be fabulous if we could do that.
So another question we have here is, do hydrogen fuel cells have a place in our industry?
Probably. Certainly as getting us off fossil fuels. That's the first point. And those are going to now be solar electric, battery storage. Hydrogen now is the distribution network. And so can you make your own hydrogen on site? Or would you have it delivered like a propane truck? Now it's a hydrogen truck. You could do that. Could you get it piped in instead of natural gas pipes? We could do a different plumbing system. You could do that. The challenge is that you can run fuel cells. There aren't very many fuel cells running on hydrogen currently. We could do that. I think that's an option that people could pursue. People who make fuel cells, if they were posed with not using natural gas and having a carbon footprint, why aren't they generating the hydrogen equivalent? If there was a commercial draw for that, I think that would quickly change. I don't believe it's a technology gap. I think it's an adoption gap.
There was another question here about, for somebody who's replanting due to fires, is there any sort of guidance on how to replant in a way that would reduce your carbon footprint? So, I think that's definitely the kind of work that we're trying to do with our best practices papers, with our vineyard trial that we're working on. And there's a lot of components of that. There's how do you build healthy soils and organic soil matter and have this very diverse microbiome in your soils. you can plant hedgerows to encourage more biodiversity. There's reduction of water use, habitat restoration, surrounding your vineyard area, monitoring your soil carbon. I think, one thing that I'm not sure, I've heard a lot of people talk about at different forums is this sort of like scope process. And Roger, maybe you could speak to that a little bit and how people can sort of decide what to prioritize when they're looking to reduce their footprint.
Can I throw up one quick slide?
Yes.
Just to show. So just in terms of clarity, so this is right-hand side is fossil carbon, left-hand side is biogenic carbon. So what we just talked about was getting the fossil carbon emission back to zero. So that's solar, that's hydrogen, that's eliminating fossil fuels of all kinds, coal, natural gas, and gasoline and diesel from fossil sources. So we could reduce our footprint on the right-hand side to zero. That's what we should be doing. But that's not good enough because we're stuck with the 400 parts in the air. Now the question is, how do we farm and how do we capture and how do we release on the left-hand side? That's the bit I was referring to. So the CO2 emission back into the air is what I'm talking about, is interrupting that with carbon capture on site. And planting in our practices is the capture of the CO2 into soil and biomass. And that's the right-hand side of that little curve. What I want you to understand in some of the carbon calculators is people wanting not to change the right-hand side, want to dip into the left-hand side to take carbon credits. And they want to buy offsets. So buying offsets doesn't change the CO2 content in the air. Did you hear what I just said? Buying offsets does not change the CO2 content in the air, and that's the problem. It's a convenient trading program, but notice that they're actually borrowing and buying from the left-hand side, which is a vineyard and a winery business, to satisfy the release on the right-hand side. So if you've got a carbon footprint that's using offsets, I'll suggest you've got a false carbon footprint. And there's nothing to be proud about talking about being carbon neutral if you're buying offsets to achieve it. You actually have to do it in an absolute sense. And now you have to go back and say, well, if I do have a vineyard and I capture it, where can I trade those credits? And that's a carbon market. Well, clearly the people on the right-hand side don't want you to do that because they would prefer just to be able to have a low-price carbon market. The future farming will be, what's the carbon value of the credit and how would you trade that? That's what the future is, and that's where the business has to grow in its understanding of carbon credits and carbon footprints. Does that help clarify? So the bottles are in the right-hand side. The bottles are because we melt down the glass and we burn the fuel to do so. And while we keep on using glass, we'll keep on making CO2. Can we make it up to zero? No, but we'd certainly reduce it to 10% or 20% of our bottle requirement if we were to go to the reuse practices immediately. It still doesn't stop the CO2 content. We have to do other things, but it's an action which is the grossest carbon component of our supply and delivery chain.
Thank you for that explanation. And, we have a comment kind of on this topic from Michael Salachi. The wine industry could begin with reusing bottles poured at the winery, followed by customers purchasing directly and returning the bottles. So type of blueprint.
Yep, I agree. And then the alternative is, would you start with large formats only? You don't want to go into a retail shelf and have to pick them up again. What would be the mechanisms? We could generate different alternatives if we had a thinking session about what would be the best way to do it. But let's start and do something. I agree. The tasting room is a good example, and you actually want people to bring back your bottles.
And there's a question, is there currently a worldwide seminar or conference that focuses on climate change and how affecting vineyards and wineries, how it's affecting vineyards and wineries specifically? So, I think this is actually, one of the forums where grape growers kind of connected with you recently was in the Porto Climate Change Conference, and grape growers sent a delegation to go and participate in that event. And you spoke about a similar topic to what you were speaking on today. So that's a great, international forum. And I think here in Napa, we want to create a forum where we can invite that sort of international conversation as well.
Sure. I think, so yeah, and I don't see any conflict in being involved in both organizations.
Right.
And in fact, there may be forums where you share content and share seminars. And so it's not contradictory, it's actually complementary. And I would encourage anybody who's joining today and hasn't heard about Porter Protocol to go to that link and consider what they're doing. And the openness is that if you join, you'll share your experiences and what worked for you and what didn't. And equally, the other partners are doing the same thing. So it's trying to be, I won't use the term best practices, but it's a practical sharing
like
example.
Case models and case studies.
Case study examples. And some of them will apply to you and some won't, but that's the group. So the question here is, so one of the methods of forest wildlife management to prevent wildfires that is suggested is prescribed fires, but these would seem counter to everything you just presented. No, I don't see them as counter at all. So if the tree falls down and it decays, and over the next 10 years, the termites and organisms break it down, the biomass of that tree is going back into the air as carbon dioxide. In the same way, when we do composting of grape skins, that material is going to go back in to the air as CO2. So that's the normal biocycle. The question is, do we want to interrupt it? We can try and do it at the rate at which the concentration of termites and organisms in the soil would let it out, but it'd be very dilute. The whole purpose for going to fermentations is it's increasingly concentrated. It's almost pure CO2. So it's not contradictory at all. Prescribed burning is actually, don't want to get too graphic, but it's almost euthanasia. It's almost deciding that this is the end of the life of a tree. And it would have died anyway, and it would have given up its CO2. We're just going to change that timescale for the benefit of the community of a particular set of trees. But that's not making more CO2. That's releasing what would have been at an earlier time. That's all it's doing.
And that actually, our next presentation will be on fire ecology. So that we'll probably get to learn a bit more about that in the next presentation. We have a few more minutes with you, though. So we have another question. Do you see biochar as a viable carbon capture method? Sure.
So where's the biochar system for the Napa Valley? Where's the supplier? Where's the groups? How would you get them engaged? We could have been doing biochar with prunings and replanting trunks when we rip out a vineyard. Where's the biochar system and who do you want to sell it to? Do you want it to go back to vineyards? Do you want to sell it for people who want to put it in their backyard? How do you create that market? More important is it's not a technology problem. People have had biochar systems for decades. And so for those of you not familiar with biochar, what are we talking about? We're talking about taking the tree or the trunk or the plant, and instead of burning it and converting it to carbon dioxide, we actually want to heat it in the presence of no oxygen. So we want to char it. We don't want to burn it. The carbon is still there, and it's again fairly concentrated. And if we were to bury that, we would have sequestered that carbon back into the ground. And that again is part of the biocycle. Instead of the release term, we're actually going to put it into the soil. Like many things we do as soil amendments, you can do them for a period of time, but they become a cumulative thing. So as the biochar is slowly breaking down, which might be 10 or 20 years, we can go for 10 years of putting biochar in, but then we'll end up with relatively high residuals. How do we manage that? Well, we can learn about that and we can manage it. And it doesn't have to be our vineyards where we're going to deposit it. So when does a forest actually become the source of a biochar depository? When does a vineyard become one? When is a commercial system for people in other parts of the world who want to carbon into their soils? Where's the trading program? it's conditional about being able to get a biochar system, mobile or stationary, somewhere where people could take their prunings and you would generate bags of biochar. You could start that. And in the world of carbon credits, you would take carbon credit for that. You would actually sell that carbon credit on a trading market. And if there was a price other than $12, which is what it is a ton in California right now, if you went to parts of Europe, people would pay $50 a ton for carbon as a credit. What's wrong with that picture? So we've got to get smarter about the business of carbon trading. And we've got to understand why what happens in California perhaps isn't what happens in the whole world. And the carbon market is a good one. So another conversation at another time would be perhaps some speakers who could speak to that. So I hope that's answered questions. If there's any last minute ones, I'll be happy. But Molly and Emily, thank you for the opportunity to speak to the group this morning. I hope it can stimulate some interest and discussion, and look forward to being part of any future ongoing discussions that could be productive. Thank you again.
Thank you for joining us. I mean, I think this has stimulated a lot of great ideas for how we can think more globally and systematically, how to create systems that actually can support us in doing more of this work. So appreciate your time today. Okay,
thank you. Bye. Bye.
And we have one more presentation for the day. It's going to begin at 1:15, so we'll just take a break until then, and we will be back with you shortly.